Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to another bookish breakfast. So currently I'm not in my own home, as you may be able to tell. I'm in an Airbnb in central London. I've just come down to spend a couple of days at the library working on my essay. However, this morning I've got something that's slightly related to my essay for you. I'm going to try and talk about TB in the Victorian era. So when I first mentioned that I was going to do my project on TB, and I also mentioned that it was the start of Victober in that week, a couple of people were like, oh, it would be really great if you could do a video about TB in the Victorian era and in Victorian literature. I would just have to say I'm not an expert on TB and I'm not an expert on Victorian literature, but I'm going to do my best because you said that you thought it would be interesting, and you know, I aim to please. So I have been reading gradually over the past month this book, Spitting Blood by Helen Bingham. Wow, that's really informative. Let's just see. Spitting Blood by Helen Bingham. And this is kind of like a biography of the disease. So it starts with the very early records of tuberculosis, scrofulous, phthisis, I have no idea how you're supposed to pronounce that, phthis, phthisis. And like the earliest records that we have of tuberculosis, and moves forward towards like the modern era. So I've just finished, I'm like reading at the point that's in the early 20th century. So I've read all the stuff that's set in Victorian times, so I can use that. I've also read like 2 or 3 articles or web pages that have given me a tiny bit more information, and then other stuff is just stuff that I've picked up knowledge-wise. So I've got some very disorganized notes, and we're going to see whether this makes any sense by the end of it. So basically, the Victorian era is quite long. I should have checked this before I started, but it's like 1837 to 1901. And a lot of things changed in that time. Britain at the start of the Victorian era was so completely different from Britain at the end of the Victorian era. And that is the same with TB. So TB really changed in character of disease and the way that it was perceived in society over the course of those, I can't quite work out off the top of my head how many years that is, like 64 years. Over those years, the way that TB was interpreted, the way that TB was perceived, went from being something that was barely understood at all but had some certain notions like attached to it, to being something that they started to have a grasp on. So I'm going to start with the like early period and then work my way through. So early on, TB was generally called consumption, and it was generally because the tuberculosis hadn't been, the bacteria hadn't been discovered, but people with TB were identified as having what were called tubercules, which were, they had really weird ways of testing for things. So they would like cut open these tuberculous nodules and like assess the inside of them, like, oh, this has got the consistency of cheese, or this one doesn't have the consistency of cheese. Like the investigative methods were really quite interesting. So yeah, people would be identified by having these tubercules and by having like a characteristic disease pattern of perhaps relapsing and remitting, perhaps having like a slow gradual decline, and generally having pulmonary symptoms. So if you don't know much about TB, the classic well-recognised form of TB is pulmonary TB, in that it causes a chest infection that lasts for years, and gradually leads to a decline if it's not treated. There are other forms of TB called extrapulmonary TB, if I can get that word out, that essentially means that any slow wasting disease in Victorian literature and elsewhere could be considered to be TB. But basically TB most commonly is found in the lungs, and that is the form where it's most likely to be contagious and be able to spread to other people, but can also be found in other body systems. So just to bear that in mind. But mainly we're going to focus on pulmonary TB because that's the most recognised form. So what was I saying? So early in the Victorian era, the view of tuberculosis was linked to how it had been viewed throughout the whole of the start of the 19th century, really, which was this really poorly explained disease that affected large numbers of people. It was known to affect families in a kind of connected way, so people were querying whether there could be some kind of hereditary link to it, even though this was a period before they really understood inheritance, the way that they could see that it ran in families. We know now that's because the families would have been living in the same environment and exposed to the same pathogens. But they did question whether that might be a cause. And they didn't really have a good understanding of transmission. They didn't really have a good way of distinguishing TB from other diseases that caused similar symptoms, at least like short-term symptoms. But they did have this idea of it being quite a romantic disease. So it was thought to be the kind of disease that like caused the death of poets and artistic people. So you've got John Keats, who very melodramatically wrote about coughing up blood one time and being like, oh, I know I'm going to die, which is true. He did know that he was going to die. And like that was kind of part of the fascination of it. The predictability of death was very important to the Victorians, and they really liked, like if you're reading a Victorian book and there's a character who's dying, the importance of that character is reflected in the way that their death is arranged, and whether or not it can be predicted, whether or not the person who's dying is aware of it and is able to like order their affairs and so on. That can really reflect how important that character is. So the idea that if you had a consumption, you knew that at some point you were probably going to decline and die. I can see that being really fascinating for the Victorians. And they had this kind of like cult of invalidism, particularly for women, and consumption was viewed as a very feminine disease, despite complete lack of medical evidence for that. So consumption did seem to affect men and women equally, but it was seen as this disease of women. And it was fashionable. And various authors have agreed on this idea that consumption was viewed as a fashionable disease. You can see it even in like caricature plates from the era. There's one in here if I can find it. So here we go. This is dropsy courting consumption. And it's a caricature, but it does show how this idea of consumption was idealised. So we've got writers like Sontag, wrote a book in 1976 talking about how consumption was portrayed and arguing that it's like seen as like a desirable almost illness. We've got, who else have we got? An author called Barnes Stevenson, who wrote about how it kind of played into the favourite Victorian sentimental fantasy of a dying young woman. I thought that was a great quote. And an author called Byrne, Byrne, who talks about how characters were spiritualised and even intellectualised by their loss of health. And there were various physical features to consumption that contributed to this idea that it was quite attractive as a disease. So firstly, they didn't realise that it was infectious, so it didn't have that kind of tarnish of being, oh, you need to back away from this person, because they didn't understand the mode of transmission. It was a disease that, and it still is, a disease that affects young people disproportionately more than it affects other age groups. So you would see young people like Keats as well, was quite young when he passed away, I think in 1820, I'm going to say. The younger of the Bronte sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, were both very young when they passed away from consumption in about 1825. You would see young people who seem to be in the prime of their life suddenly begin to waste away and be affected by consumption. And that was... that enhanced the beauty, the romance of the disease, that it affected people who didn't seem like they should be affected. It was seen as being a beautiful disease for a couple of reasons. So as it advances, it causes severe weight loss and wasting. So people would start to look particularly slender. And there was this ideal for like women to have like a kind of like a tubular body shape where they would be very, very slim, very, very slight, and wearing clothes that, if you think of like the early 19th century outfits that looked a little bit like nighties that you might wear when you were in bed sick. So that it kind of like played into the current beauty ideals of somebody who was like slim, slender, and also frail. So like historically there has been this idea that women are frail, they can't cope with exertion, and they need to be looked after by men. And if you had a woman who had consumption, she would fit these things. She wouldn't be able to tolerate a lot of exercise, so she would show this kind of graceful need to then like go and rest and collapse every couple of minutes, which kind of played into their ideas about gender. And you would also see somebody with very, very pale skin, generally quite pale, but when they were having like what they called like a hectic, but like a low-grade fever, they would then have a flushed cheek and very red lips. This is actually described for Helen Burns Charlotte Bronte describes these symptoms of having her cheeks becoming brighter red, her eyes seeming really bright, and she describes this as her spirit seemed hastening to live within a very brief span. So the symptoms of the fever were interpreted as being something almost like religious and like to do with the soul of the person who was suffering. It's interesting. It's alarming, but it's also interesting. And they were also thought to be more sensitive to like art, literature. I couldn't really find out why this was thought, but potentially because they couldn't really exercise very much, so maybe they were reading books more, I don't know. And we also had a couple of like supposedly tuberculous figures appearing in artworks at the time, so particularly like the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. One of their models, Elizabeth Siddal, was characterised as being a consumptive. It's unclear whether her symptoms actually were consumption, but it was thought she was portrayed as having a consumption. So the main literary character from this period who kind of like characterises this idea about tuberculosis is Helen Burns, who I've already mentioned. So she is a character in Jane Eyre. She's quite early on in the book, and like part of the interest of this passage where Helen Burns is that the young Jane Eyre doesn't really know and doesn't really understand about illness, and as the reader you can pick up signs that Helen Burns is not well, but Jane Eyre does not notice that until quite late on. So Helen Burns, slight spoiler for very early in the book, skip ahead 5 minutes if you don't want to know, but Helen Burns passes away from consumption, and she dies of consumption at the same time as there is an epidemic in the school of another infectious disease. I'm going to say it's typhus or typhoid, but I think typhus is more likely. I should have checked. And it just interests me, like, why does Helen Burns die of consumption at the same time as all of the other poor children in the school are dying of a known to be infectious fever that was associated with poverty, dirty water, like not that was fully understood at the time, but it was recognised as having this pattern of affecting people in epidemics in that kind of very bad living conditions that they had in a very like rapid way, whereas consumption, it's also linked to poor living conditions, but it's more of a long-term disease. And one aspect of Helen Burns dying of consumption, I think, is a reference to Bronte's own sisters. So I've already said Maria and Elizabeth Bronte died of tuberculosis, but also by the time Jane Eyre was published in 1847, Emily and Anne Bronte were both in a kind of tuberculous decline. Like they both, I think Emily died in 1848 and Anne died in 1849, both thought to be from tuberculosis. So the fact that Charlotte Bronte wanted to put that in kind of reflects her own family's experience of the disease. So it's possibly that. The other thing about tuberculosis is it wasn't purely seen as a disease of poverty. So I've mentioned already there was this association with fashionable young women. So by giving a poor, I think she's not orphaned, I think her father's alive, but a poor girl in an orphanage, this kind of like disease that's seen as noble, she elevates her as a character and makes her almost more worthy of respect and interest from her readers. It also means that she's kept separate from the other people who are suffering, so she gets this kind of special status, and it allows her this kind of deathbed scene. Like I was saying, Victorian characters, if they're more important, they get a more important deathbed scene, so it gets Jane and Helen get to spend this time alone talking about the end of Helen's life. Not like openly, but they get to have that kind of spiritual conversation at the end. And she's got this slow decline. Like I said, Jane Eyre doesn't quite understand that she's going through this slow decline, but the reader does, and that adds to the pathos and the knowledge that somebody's got consumption that gradually affects them over time. Does add to the pathos of a character, where we know that this illness is not getting better, because at the time there was no proper treatment. There was some very weird treatment methods, but there was no effective treatment. I think that's pretty much all I've got to say about Helen Burns. Oh, just also, like, giving her consumption as a disease, it was comparatively much less messy and disfiguring than other diseases. Charlotte herself said it was a flattering malady. I think she said this in quite a wry way in a letter, writing about her sister becoming very unwell with it. I think she was kind of using some dark humour there. I don't think she was actually saying that her sister was flatteringly ill, but it wasn't seen as the kind of disease that would lead to you like getting huge scars. It wasn't a disease that would lead to you like vomiting everywhere. It could be very, very unpleasant. Helen actually tells Jane in the story that her disease is not painful, but it is. But it wasn't seen as being as unpleasant as many of the other diseases that were rampant at the time. So that kind of gave it a kind of desirability almost. So, excuse me. That's like the early period of TB in the Victorian era. Then we get to, the last thing to say about that is that Dora Wordsworth, that's William Wordsworth's daughter, also died of TB in about 1850, I think, and he was distraught and he planted a whole field of daffodils for her in recognition of this, and kind of because of his poetic link to the Romantics, I kind of felt like that fitted into the early TB period where it's seen as this kind of romantic disease. Anyway, moving on to phase two. Phase two starts around 1850, where suddenly public health becomes a thing. So pretty much before 1850, medicine was useless, healthcare was useless. The only thing you could do for somebody was like basically be nice to them while they were ill. There was no real effective treatment for almost anything. Around about 1850, people started to realise, I won't go into it too much, but they started to realise that you could look after certain things in society and this would improve the health of that society as a whole. So we started to see things like Factory Acts and Poor Acts and so on that started to tackle things like slum housing, and this had a measurable impact on tuberculosis. And over this period, tuberculosis came to be seen more as like a capitalist disease. So Marx even said consumption was essential, or I think necessary was his word, to the existence of capitalism. So having these diseases of the working poor somehow propped up the capitalist systems. And as the Industrial Revolution took off, basically TB is a disease that spreads very easily in very close, damp, poorly lit, poorly ventilated living conditions. So as people moved from the rural to the urban, we started to see a lot more TB in cities, and that made it easier to characterise the way that it worked as a disease. So there's a couple of literary characters that kind of fit into this idea of TB linked to industrialisation. There's apparently somebody in Dombey and Son, but I haven't read Dombey and Son, so if you have a little think to yourself about who that could be and what it kind of represents. But the one that leapt to mind for me was from 1853's from Elizabeth Gaskell's 1853 novel North and South. We've got Bessy Higgins. So Bessy Higgins identifies her own illness as being caused by fluff on the lung. She is a factory worker in a textiles mill, and she identifies that it's due to breathing in particles of cloth in the air, which makes sense. And she may well not have tuberculosis, but I think there's enough doubt there, and I know that other authors have suggested that there's enough doubt there, that it's worth sort of mentioning her as a character, because she may well have had basically an occupational lung disease that was brought on by breathing in this dust. It's called brown lung. But there were a lot of occupational risks for TB, particularly for factory workers. So in a textiles factory such as the one that Bessy was in, you would have had hot, humid air that was preferred for the setup of the factory, and hot, humid air that's perfect for bacteria to stay alive in. You also would have had a lot of poor lighting, so the tuberculosis bacteria is actually killed by sunlight, which, yeah, go sunlight. So if you were having somebody who lived in dark conditions and worked in dark conditions, they would be more exposed to sort of environmental pathogens because they would not be being killed off by the sunlight. And one of the key things for tuberculosis, even up to today, is good ventilation of the room to keep that bacteria moving out into the sunlight where it will be killed. And there was not very good ventilation in a lot of these factories. So in North and South, there's a reference to the installation of fans in mills to clear off the dust, and this was noticed as making an improvement in workers' health, and the reason for putting them in was not like an operational reason, it was purely for the benefit of your workers, and that in itself would have made a big difference to the risk of tuberculosis inside these factories. the thing with tuberculosis is if you're sharing a space with somebody who's got it, then you're more likely to get it. So if one person in the factory has got it, and they're coughing it out into this like hot, humid air, which in itself would promote them coughing due to like the stimulation of the lungs, then you were putting the rest of your factory workers at risk from that, because they are more likely to catch it. But that's the kind of transmission thing that was still not very well understood at the time, but it would have had a part to play. We also had like urban poverty, as I've said, kind of affecting the spread of TB. So in 1864 to 1867, there was something called the Salford cotton famine, which basically saw a rise in TB going against a decline that had. So Salford was having a decline in TB, but they had this cotton famine where they weren't importing cotton from the US because of conflict. This then caused them to have a rise in TB in spite of that decline, if that makes sense, like a spike in the number of cases, because people were not able to work, so they were moving into worse quality housing, they were cutting back on essentials such as food, and poor nutritional state is really bad for making somebody more susceptible to TB. So basically you're exposed to TB, you can fight it off. You need to have a nice robust immune system in order to be able to do that. So you need to be well nourished, you need to be like well looked after, or you can kind of trap it, and your body like traps it and puts it away, and it becomes a latent TB infection. And if you have a latent TB infection, which many people could have and not know about, then if you go through a period where you've got worse living conditions, worse nutrition, it affects your immune status, then that latent infection can become an active infection. So you can see why a period of like famine and hardship would lead to a spike in TB. But then as conditions that were linked to living conditions, social conditions, became more and more understood over the period of the 1850s, 60s, we then, because people were understanding it more, people were putting more controls in place. So you had like I've mentioned, action on slum housing, you had factory acts, you had changes to the way that people were allowed to live, and more socially conscious laws were made. That led to TB beginning to reduce. So that was a really positive thing in terms of the control of TB. But at the same time, because of this association with factory workers, with urban slums, TB stopped being this image of like a middle to upper class woman who was very elegant and very ill, and like beautiful and slender, and became something that was associated with poverty and hardship. So it changed the way that it was perceived as a disease. Moving on from that, as we get into like a later stage, we were looking at like different kinds of treatment that people were suggesting for TB. So there was a move towards sanatoriums, and if you could afford it, you were supposed to go abroad to somewhere where it was, sorry about that noise, to somewhere it was nice and sunny, and you would be able to like spend a lot of time outside, because that was thought to help you to recover. May well have been helpful. But if you were not able to afford that, you might go to a sanatorium in England, or in the UK, sorry, where you would still be expected to be out in the open air as much as possible. So you would be out in the cold air, and there would be open windows all the time. Like I said, good ventilation is really, really important. But if you think about being, there's a writer, I think in like the 1920s, I'm going to say Betty MacDonald, who was in a sanatorium in like the Mendips in England, and the windows were open all winter long, so you've got like wind and rain coming in through the windows as well. That's possibly taking the idea of ventilation a little bit too far. So yeah, if you could afford it, you would have gone abroad to one of these lovely sanatoriums in like the Alps or something to enjoy the views and enjoy your recovery, but that wasn't always possible. We also had around 1862, it's French, but I just thought I'd throw it in anyway, Fantine in Les Mis apparently dies of consumption. So you've got this blending of the noble image of consumption as a disease with the recognition that it is a disease of poor social conditions, social risk factors. So yeah, what we would call today the social determinants of health, which is like the things around you that affect how your health is going to come out. So things that you can't necessarily change, like the housing that you live in, the prevalence of smoking in your community, things like that is going to affect your health behaviours and the way that your health turns out. So yeah, moving on from that, we then suddenly got into a period where science started to have an impact, more than just public health. We began to have like a proper understanding of health and disease. So in 1876, a guy called Koch, maybe, who I think was German, came up with germ theory. So he isolated the anthrax bacteria. So previously they had understood that some diseases were contagious, but they didn't know how or why that worked. And there were various theories of like miasmas and what have you. But he was able to actually say, look, this is a bacteria and it is causing ill health when it goes from one place to another place. That very rapidly took off as a field. And in 1882, TB bacteria was isolated. So that's Mycobacterium tuberculosis. You also had bovine TB, you might have heard of that because of the badger control laws that have been going on. So people could get TB from drinking unpasteurized milk. That always makes me think of Tess and taking milk up to put it on the train to send it to London. Nice, fresh, unpasteurized, possibly tuberculose milk. That's actually made me think of like a character like Retty Priddle. She's quite like dainty, could be possibly a little bit consumptive-y looking, but she's not ill in the book. So anyway, and that led to, because there was this understanding of the bacteria that gradually got more and more traction, that led to kind of like specific treatments that focused on like the idea of that bacteria. So in 1887, somebody opened a specific clinic in Edinburgh that was just for treating tuberculose patients and started looking into things like contact tracing. So not necessarily calling it that, but going to people's houses, looking how they were living at home and thinking about their family, were family members at risk, and like thinking about methods of controlling the spread of the disease from a bacterial contagion perspective. So what this meant was that over the course of the latter part of the Victorian era, TB was increasingly associated and identified as a disease of the poor. There were clear social risk factors, some of which included things like alcoholism. So there was a certain amount of condemnation of these social behaviours. There was a degree of blaming of the people who acquired tuberculosis, because it was felt like, firstly, they should have limited their risk factors to not catch the disease in the first place, and secondly, they were blamed as in they were seen as likely to spread the disease and make other people unwell. Because it was now understood as an epidemic, I've got an author who I failed to write down the name of. I think it might have been the Byrne, Byrne. That basically the individual is no longer exceptional. It's no longer interesting and romantic having this one individual with tuberculosis, because it is seen as being part of this wider epidemic that is a social problem that needs to be controlled. To go on with this, the need to like try and control the disease, we had very strict paternalistic therapy rules, and wishes to like make the disease notifiable. So if you found someone with tuberculosis, you were legally obliged to inform people. I'm not sure when that actually eventually came in. I know in the in the US it was like the 1890s, but I'm not sure when it came in England. And obviously it is important to notify when you've got a dangerous infectious disease that might be spread, but it's all about the discourse on that and like how that is framed, and whether it's framed as like picking people out. That leads to a lot of social stigma. So we kind of saw the emergence of stigma around TB around that period. And there were increasing preoccupations over shared public spaces and like how disease might be spread in these shared public spaces. So people with TB were seen to be doing harm to other people around them. Then there were also, like I've mentioned, like strict paternalistic therapy rules. There were also very dangerous treatments that people were expected to undergo to try and make themselves better. I think it came in slightly later, like the 1920s, but they started doing like artificial pneumothorax, so deliberately collapsing a lung to see whether that would make the TB any better. So really weird strategies that they were resorting to, because there was still no effective treatment. Despite the cause of the disease being understood, there was no way of tackling that because we didn't have antibacterial treatments. And sanatoria were blamed for causing laziness and lassitude. So if you went into a sanatorium, you were seen as like, oh, now you're just gonna rest and relax, and that's like not a desirable trait. So they ended up doing things like working cures, where people who were ill were expected to also like dig ditches and then fill the ditches back in to to increase their exercise tolerance. So they had really weird strategies. So it became like not such a nice thing to suffer from. Like, gone were the days of, oh, keep you in a darkened room and keep things quiet, which obviously keeping in a darkened room is a bad idea. But anyway, it became like a much, there was a very different environment around you as a TB sufferer then. And it was seen moralistically, so the Victorians were great for seeing everything moralistically. So the disease could be a form of a punishment, and it was also seen as a biological evil. That's an author called Day who used that expression, rather than being this romantic disease. And there was also, over that time period, there had been a change in which body shapes were viewed as attractive, and that kind of like slim, slender figure was no longer so well appreciated, and we were more into like the curvy shapes of the